My attention was caught by the music that I would usually hear every morning. It was already like an alarm that my auditory memory used as a cue for me to get up and start the day. It was the rock reggae music in a continuous playlist of my friend and housemate, Gary. I walked out of my room and saw him in front of the PC, as usual, browsing random things that only the likes of him would be interested in. His head would usually nod with the slow beat of the song as he mutters the lyrics. Either he really was too high to form proper sentences, or never really got to learn the lines. Our floor was made of wooden planks that would squeak every time someone would walk across the living room, which also served as the dining area. No matter how high he was, or how loud the music was playing, he would always hear the squeaks and turn his head. He would always greet me with his wide smile and dopey eyes, and start his usual rant that I often didn't care enough to absorb. But not this time. The moment he turned his head, the sound distorted as the picture blurred like an old burning film. He just stared at me without any expression at all, and then he screamed. It was just a dream, triggered by my homesickness and treasured memories. A dream that was turned into a nightmare due to the recent events of our reality. Gary's dead. I killed him myself. The scream was stuck in my ears as I opened my eyes. I felt the cold railings on the sides of my bed and the thick, itchy leather wrapped around my neck, legs, and arms. I was bound on the bed again. They were treating the wounds that I got from my previous fight. Despite of being an underground freak show, their medical equipment was pretty advanced. My cuts were being sealed shut by a laser, and I could barely feel any pain. Nothing really hurt aside from the deep puncture wound on my abdomen, the last strike from Gary that also became an opening for my finishing blow that ended his life quite brutally. The stain of his blood was still on the arced blade that was permanently attached to my left arm. The moment when my sword cut right through his body was embedded in my mind. I still remember how the rage took over me. It must have been from the IVs that they attached to me since I got to this place, and another one was attached to me again as I was getting repaired. I didn't want any more of it. I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to wake up again in this hellish reality, but all I could do was scream. But just like before, they just sedated me when I started acting out and my mind drifted away again. Somehow, I liked it better than being awake. Days passed, I assumed. I could only know that a long time has passed because I could feel my long beard brushing against the iron mask they put me in. The concept of time was blurred to me ever since I got here. I was force-fed through a tube. I defecated and urinated on the same cage I was locked in. They would just hose me down as a form of cleaning, like an unwanted animal, and I could feel my sanity drifting away with my humanity, little by little. All of a sudden, a zap from a taser woke me up. The ambient yellow light that hardly lit this gloomy room cut through the darkness of my unconsciousness as I opened my eyes. I was in my cage again, amongst the other freaks on the corridor. I was about to go on a match again. Like before, they pulled my cage to bring me to the battleground where the stench of blood oozes through the air. Countless slaughters must have happened in there for that smell to sting in such a way. And I saw the poor, helpless freaks once again, and they pulled my cage across the room. And there I saw something that I didn't notice before. They assigned them names that suited the modifications done to them. The amputee, mounted on steel wheels, holding a spiky shield and a lance, was named Knight, for obvious reasons. The one that could barely fit in his cage because of his iron stilts was called Spitfire, because of the flamethrower mounted on his mask, and the biggest one I have seen so far, sitting like a docile, giant beast, was referred to as the Juggernaut. Like before, they left me inside the battleground as they closed the thick steel doors behind them. As the bright lights lit up and the cameras rolled, a beep sounded which unlocked the cages. I slowly walked out of my cage and turned my head to the plate above it, where the names were written. I looked at the crescent sword with jagged edge mounted on my arm. They called me the Reaper. The masked person on the opposite side of the room was quite loud. A chainsaw was the weapon chosen for him by whoever armed him. Despite this situation, which I could clearly lose my life limb by limb, I somehow felt relatively calm. I felt no fear. In the face of this ominous image of a madman in front of me, I didn't seem to feel threatened at all. Hell, I felt like I've lost my soul. I felt like I had nothing left to lose. He started to yell like a lunatic as he charged towards me. This scenario was so terribly familiar, and it triggered a memory that I wished to forget. As he got closer and closer, he reminded me of the time when Gary did the same thing inside this same room. He swung his noisy chainsaw towards me, and I just moved away easily. The weight of his weapon made him unable to move and maneuver quickly. A chainsaw could be terrifying and quite an intimidating weapon of choice, but it was simply impractical for this kind of combat. I could easily dodge before he could complete his swing, and I didn't even need to raise my sword. The large movements that he had to make just made his actions quite predictable. He finally pointed down his chainsaw as he screamed out of frustration. He couldn't even put a scratch on me, and he was mad because of it. I was taking this match too lightly, and I would soon realize it. Someone had to die for this match to end, and a person fighting for his own survival will do anything. Once inflicted in a good amount of pain, the thing that was put inside us would react. Adrenaline would trigger and increase in a very unnaturally fast pace, like a clunky machine that was suddenly turned in full throttle. Aside from his reactions, the sense of conscience and human reasoning would be completely overwhelmed by an uncontrollable rage, turning an average person like me into a merciless monster. I realized this once I had felt it kick in for the first time, and apparently, so did he. He started wounding himself with his chainsaw. He ran it against his legs and arms as blood gushed out and bits of his flesh flung to the air. He screamed on the top of his lungs as he tried to endure the pain, and I could hear how the sound of his suffering voice suddenly turned into a violent bellow that resembled a deeply angered beast. He wounded himself to trigger his own rage. He charged toward me once again, but he moved significantly quicker. He swung his chainsaw towards me as if it weighed nothing, and I managed to escape just by a hair. I lost my balance and I fell to the ground. He clearly overpowered me, but there was one thing that he failed to realize. There was no way that a chainsaw would cut through a dense steel like my blade. Since he was way too fast and too strong for me, all I could do was raise my curved sword as I was still stuck on the ground. I anchored the end of my blade on the floor to absorb his impact, and he attacked when he deemed my situation helpless. As his chainsaw clashed against my blade, the teeth of his saw was dulled, and the chain was derailed. As it did, a few shallow nicks on my sword. But his weapon was totally trashed. After then, I didn't know what has gotten into me that I reacted in such a way. I stared at him as I slowly revealed a malicious grin on my face, telling him that it was all over. I stood up with confidence and angst as he backed away little by little. And looking back, it was very foolish for me to behave in a way that I did. Even though the chainsaw was no longer running, he was still holding a heavy tool. He began swinging his weapon at me once again out of desperation, and the derailed chain was caught on my neck, which lacerated me when he forcefully pulled back. It could have killed me, and it seemed he didn't even think that would happen. As blood flowed out of my wound, intense heat started creeping through my veins as my heart rate increased several times over. It was happening again, and it was overtaking my consciousness significantly faster than before. I felt like another person totally took over me, and all I could do was watch as my body was controlled by sheer anger. But there was something different. There was something even darker. I looked at this man in front of me with a different set of eyes. We were all going to die here anyway. It just happened that he had to die by my hands. I started to swing my crescent sword with an obvious intent to kill. He was being knocked back as I shattered what was left of his pathetic weapon of choice. I stepped forward as I threw a full swing, and it almost cut his arm off. It loosely dangled as he screamed and screeched in pain like feeble prey. Further enraged and robbed off of his sensible judgment, he charged toward me with nothing. He didn't even manage to come close as I swung my blade with such force and hit his head, penetrating his skull. I killed another man again. As his head slowly slipped off my blade, I found myself staring at this gruesome scene that I made. He fell on the floor as blood spilled out from his head like an opened can, reaching my feet. I just stood there and stared. Unlike before, where I was enraged like a growling, mindless beast, my hostility was channeled through the immense intensity of my ruthlessness and inhumanity, and to project it in a quiet and a relatively calculated manner. I totally gave in, and it felt like I didn't even try to hold back. I was turned into a cold-blooded slayer. My title suited me well. I was indeed turned into a reaper. I calmly walked back to my cage like an obedient pet. They opened the steel bars and pulled me back to the corridor. As I got in, I saw the freaks looking at me. They stared at me as my cage moved past them, like I was some kind of dangerous animal. My left arm was shaking and the sword was banging against the rails of my cage. My rage hasn't completely subsided yet, and I was trying to contain myself as hard as I could. And suddenly, I heard a snickering of a very small, high-toned voice coming from the cage of the juggernaut. His cage was not too far from mine, and I could see that this 7-foot muscular giant's mouth was not opening. As I looked closer, I realized that it was impossible for him to speak. His mouth appeared as if it were smothered in fire and melted his skin. A part of his jaw was exposed, and his mouth was sealed completely. And then I heard the little voice again. He slowly turned on his back, and I was shocked when I realized who was talking. A bald midget with no legs was attached to his back, flesh to flesh. He was like a tumor that had a life of his own. I didn't know how I should react to this oddity, but he just started running his mouth. He told me that I was pretty good at the game since rookies rarely get out of the battleground twice, and that I would soon grow popularity towards the audience, and they would start to pit me against prominent players such as them. As the midget kept rambling, another death match was about to begin. They started pulling the cage of the knight towards the battleground. As the steel doors opened, the knight started screaming. He was totally terrified of what he saw in the room. He screamed at the top of his lungs, repeating the same words. "Not the Diablo! Not the Diablo!" I tried to see what he was talking about as I struck my head between the rails of the cage as far as I could. All I could see was a silhouette of a man standing right in the center of the battleground, and yet the silhouette alone was already quite disturbing. It was a huge man with horns, flailing around a huge steel ball like it was nothing. And the door was closed shut, leaving the terrified knight inside. The midget told me that the knight would not return in one piece for sure, and that he must have pissed off a number of audience for him to be put in such a fate. He said that facing the Diablo for even just a minute meant certain death. I would ask him who the strange man was, why did he have horns, and how the hell could he play with a huge weapon so effortlessly? The answers to my questions made me recognize the feeling of absolute fear once again. Unlike most of us, the person they referred to as the Diablo volunteered to be here. The horns were nothing more but aesthetics, but it fits his personality more than anyone would imagine. He was a naturally gifted individual born with superior physique, and the experiments conducted to him for years has made him into a terrifying beast above all. On top of that, he was incredibly ruthless since the beginning. This underground death match used to be nothing more but a common fistfight against felons and traitors of the Syndicate. But everything about it was pushed beyond the limits when he came along. Although, unlike before, he became nothing more than a dead end for those players who the viewers lost interest in, since there was no one else that would match him for years. I asked the midget how did he know all these things, and he told me that he used to be one of them. He was a member who was overwhelmed by debts of astronomical amount due to losing consecutive bets on this freak show. He was captured and amputated when he tried to run away from them. When they discovered that he tried to bribe one of the handlers of the players that was supposed to face the juggernaut, they did this to him as a punishment before the match began. The audience liked it, so they decided to keep them attached permanently. Just a few minutes later, the steel doors opened again. After hearing all the information about this Diablo, I wasn't expecting the knight to get back alive, but I also wasn't expecting it to be this worse. Instead of a dead body missing a few limbs, they came back with a number of trash bags. The knight wasn't just decapitated. His flesh was torn to shreds. I could hear the Diablo's laughter from the battleground, and a cold sweat suddenly flowed across my face. How could a human possibly do this? And what the hell was he? After that day, the image of the Diablo haunted me. Like what the midget predicted. I started competing against stronger opponents as the time passed. Even if I wouldn't admit it, I knew that the lives of the people I took was starting to become less and less important to me. I wasn't even doing it to survive. Whenever I get wounded, my primal drive would take over my body, and I became what they expect me to be. And before I knew it, I had reached 5 wins. At that point, I couldn't brush off the thought of this imminent nightmare. The Diablo was the incarnation of the devil himself. Even for a cold-blooded slayer like me who was gradually getting used to this inhumane sport, the thought of facing him would always terrify me. However, after seeing a glimpse of his unimaginable strength, a far-fetched hope started to build up inside my head. After winning another deathmatch, I faced the cameras and boldly made a statement. I wished for a match against Diablo. And it happened. I was wakened by the strong pressure of a water hose for the day of my requested nightmare. But what they didn't realize was I wasn't really sleeping since they left me. As usual, 2 men started pulling my cage across the corridor to bring me to the battleground. As we passed the cage of the fire starter, one of the men opened the steel doors. They did not expect what happened next. The fire started torching the 2 guys. The corridor had a couple of surveillance cameras. Armed men would surely come soon, but not as soon as the other guy who saw what the fire starter just did. From the small opening of the steel door, I could see Diablo standing at the center of the battleground, not locked in a cage, and could freely roam as he pleased. He was here for a long time. He wanted a challenge. I just stared at him as the 2 guys of the Syndicate was burning in front of me until the steel door was closed shut. I couldn't break out of my cage. None of us can. But one man could, and he just rammed his giant morning star against the steel door. The thick iron ball that he was carrying with him opened the thick door completely, and he came straight at me. Firestarter tried to torch him, but as expected, it didn't do anything. He just rammed his giant steel ball towards him so that he would stop, bending the rails of his cage. He effortlessly bent the railings of my cage as well with his bare hands as he tried to reach for me. But then the gunmen of the Syndicate finally arrived and opened fire. Enraged and irritated, Diablo forcefully pushed my cage toward the gunmen, killing them instantly. And just like him, I was also hit by a few bullets when the gunman fired. My adrenaline was triggered, and I jumped back up quickly. I squeezed myself out in between the bent bars and immediately ran towards the cage of the Juggernaut. Juggernaut swung his huge axe towards Diablo, but it barely went through his skin. He kept on throwing heavy slashes of his giant axe despite of not making any damage. As his attention was on Juggernaut, I snuck behind him and tried to cut him as hard as I could from the back. I could see in his face that he was very irritated as the 2 of us were ganging up on him. Little did he know, it was all a diversion. More gunmen appeared and rained their gunshots to all of us. If it wasn't for the iron mask put on me, I would have died pretty easily. Diablo grabbed his morning star so that he could throw it towards the gunmen, but Juggernaut snuck the handle and wrapped it around a couple of railings of his cage. Diablo effortlessly snapped the rails open and threw a steel ball towards the gunmen, but they came in several consecutive waves. The corridor was too narrow for all of them, and they ignored one more freak that got out of his cage first before I did. Firestarter blew his flames on the gunmen and torched as much as he could. Unfortunately, there were just too many of them. Because of the iron slits fixed on his arms and legs, Firestarter couldn't move away as quickly as he should. He was easily gunned down. However, they disregarded the tank on his back, and it exploded as they shot at him unsparingly, causing a moment of shock and an opening for us. But as I looked back to grab Juggernaut with me so that we could run away, he was already caught by the monstrous grip of Diablo. The midget just yelled and cursed at him, but just a fling of a finger from Diablo snapped his neck and killed him instantly. There was no turning back. I just ran away from the gunshots and Diablo as fast as I could. I was severely wounded by the numerous bullets I received, but the unnatural adrenaline kept me going. As I finally surfaced, I discovered that we were on an island. I had to cut down a few men that got in the way, and still kept accumulating gunshots during the process. I ran and ran until I finally saw a boat, and I just pulled up the anchor and aimlessly sailed. Hell, anywhere else would be better than there. As I sailed away, I could see Diablo standing at the entrance of the underground. No one else was there. Hell, he must have killed them all. He didn't even try to get me. He just stood there and stared until he could no longer see my sails. Our plan for escape was pretty reckless since we had to rely on Diablo's monstrous strength and uncontrollable rage to cause chaos. We knew that we could die, but it was better than risking our lives for nothing but entertainment for the sick bastards behind their screens. And I wish I could have saved at least one life. But the circumstances was just not in our control, and it was just by luck that I got out alive myself. I've killed a lot of men. There was nothing I could do to change what happened. And as I remained alive, I know that the Syndicate would try to track me down. If I'm able to tell my story, at least the tragedy that befell us would be known before my chances run out. I was a victim. But I was also the Reaper.